All right, so let's start Module 5. Part 1, we're going to talk about objectives and how to create objectives with appropriate learning outcomes. You may be thinking, why are we doing this in a module about database individualization? Well, I'll tell you, because that's what we're going to learn to start, is how objectives are relevant within the DBI framework. Then we're going to talk about how to select objectives based on student performance relative to the goals that you have for them. And finally, how to create very focused objectives that include a description of the learning outcome that will ultimately show mastery. So let's talk about this role of objectives first in terms of explicit instruction, because that's what this whole course is about. So if you think about our explicit instruction model, here are kind of the core components of explicit instruction. What's critical here is that you must teach something meaningful. And I can't stress this enough because in my experience, I have, as a teacher, thought of lessons as like, oh, this will be a great lesson to do. And I think to myself, actually, that's not really that important for students to learn. And I found this in my experiences that sometimes, especially newer teachers, will teach things that sound interesting, but I think, but is that really meaningful? So that's really important, and that's why we need to focus first on having a clear objective with an important focus for the student that relates to a goal that you have for them and a very specific learning outcome. So let's then talk about how this does fit into the DBI framework. Starting over here, you know that one type of intervention adaptation is to increase the use of explicit instruction principles. And why do we do that in database individualization? We do that when a student needs an adaptation, when we realize students haven't responded to instruction. And what we find when we evaluate student diagnostic data is we realize maybe there's something about the instruction that we needed to change. And if we do that, then we need to make sure that the objectives are very clear. That's all well and good. But if you remember from the beginning of the DBI process, the first thing we do is we start with a secondary prevention program. So if we have a program already, presumably the program has objectives, so why would we bother talking about objectives at all? There is a reason. Even if you have a program, programs don't always specify the objectives in a way that maximizes learning. In other words, sometimes programs don't actually give you a clear picture of what it is they want students to learn, which can either mean that you don't actually focus the lesson the way that even the program may have intended, or they may not have focused on the optimal things that you want to teach. A second problem I found in many programs is that they try to cover too many things at once, and they have 10, 12, 15 objectives for a lesson, when in fact, one or two objectives is important, or breaking the lesson into smaller objectives is really important. And so they may also come up with learning outcomes that don't match the objectives. For example, I found cases where it's a decoding lesson, a phonics lesson, and then the assessment is to spell words. And that's a great assessment for a spelling objective, not a great assessment for a reading objective. So that's all, even in the context of a program, you're going to want to focus on objectives. But if you don't have a program, it's going to be just as important because you're going to have to design the explicit instruction yourself, which means you need to come up with very good objectives. So you have a scope and sequence of things that the students are going to learn. So it's probably even more important to think very carefully about objectives if you don't have a program. But all the same, objectives are critical. Now you still may be thinking though, why are we doing this if we're focusing so much on the instructional practices? It's because the instructional practices are driven by the objective. And too often we do something where we don't focus on exactly what we want the students to learn, because that's what the objective does. It focuses in on what we want, exactly what they want the students to learn. Instead, we end up completing lessons that are about a topic where we say something like, we are learning about triangle congruence. And that about is a key word that suggests to me that the teacher, even myself, has not actually thought about what is going to be learned about triangle congruence. What is the actual objective? What's the outcome you want students to achieve? And that's a common thing when lessons aren't fully thought through in that way. Another example of a topic would be about cause and effect. Learning about cause and effect is very important, but what are students expected to know about it, and how are they going to show you your understanding? That's one thing, it's just a topic. Another thing is an activity. If you have never in your career as a teacher found a worksheet and then photocopied it and printed it out and gave it to the students as something to do, I don't believe that you've ever been a teacher because all of us at some point in our career have done an activity that was basically just a worksheet. And the reason we did that was we were sort of thinking of, I want something to do, or this is an interesting worksheet. But we weren't thinking about how the worksheet was going to actually teach something meaningful to our students. It's not that worksheets are bad, it's just that if it's just that, it's an activity, it's not objective driven, that's a problem. Even something that we would think of as a good practice, like completing a Venn diagram, even something like that isn't any good if it's just an activity to complete the Venn diagram. If it's not really focused on an objective we want students to have, like to compare and contrast themselves. The Venn diagram can be a tool for that, but if the activity itself, we're completing a Venn diagram, if that's the focus of the lesson, it's not an objective, and that's a problem. And as I already said, this can be true even within a secondary prevention program. Often these programs are well written, but they don't always have lessons with very clear objectives, which sometimes makes them either hard to use or makes them sort of meander. And we'll see later, I'm going to give you some examples of programs in which the objectives aren't clearly specified and where you may want to make changes to the program in order to make them more responsive to student needs. What happens instead then is teachers in these secondary prevention programs come up with lots of things to do. And not all the things that they do really help drive the objectives. So in this example, we have a teacher working with a small group of fifth graders who need intensive intervention reading comprehension. Teacher's planning a lesson for the coming week and decides, well, I have a program. It suggests we read the book. It doesn't really say how to read the book. It focuses on fluency. But I want to focus on kids' reading comprehension, and so I need something to do. I recently learned about this survey, question, read, recite, review strategy, also called SQ3R. And I read about this on a teacher website. I thought, oh, this is something I'll do. This will be a fun activity for the students. And so the teacher writes in the lesson plan book, shared reading, sunken treasure, that's the name of a book there, and SQ3R together, sort of written in this horrible font there. Now, the problem with that SQ3R together is it is not an objective. This is an activity. The activity is a problem because the teacher has not thought the activity through. It's not clear that we know what together means here. It's not clear how the teacher intends to do this with the students with this together. There are lots of steps in this process, and the teacher is making a graphic organizer. But that's a long book. Are we going to do this process 20 times throughout the lesson? It's also clear here that the learning outcome itself is not specified. Is the outcome to just complete the whole graphic organizer? Not clear. And then it's also not clear how the students will actually interact with this. Is there going to be a copy for the LCD projector, or is it going to be drawn on the board? That's not clearly specified either. And finally, it's not clear that students are actually prepared to do this, because the teacher in this example didn't provide any prior instruction on this strategy. So for students to master strategy in a single lesson after never having done it all for a 20-page book seems like a really bad idea. And I know it's a bad idea because I did it. And so I use this example to make clear that I think about this for myself. Like, I have been here, I have done this, I have come up with lessons that don't have good objectives, and the results were predictable. They actually didn't go well. The reason this happens is that we often do what's called organizational planning. We focus on the activity and the materials. We're going to do this activity, I'm going to use this worksheet. And this is where I have the worksheet example here. We don't do what I like to call cognitive planning, thinking about how we're going to do the lesson. The cognitive planning means that we are thinking about our objective carefully. And often what is not clear in people's minds is what the learning outcome will be. What does it look like for students to master the objective? So ultimately, the activities and materials get selected not because they meet the objective and are shown in a learning outcome, but because maybe they're fun, or they're easy to think about, or they sort of match some idea of a practice like I had seen on a website. So all those things are not good examples of, all these things here, well, all the programs I give are not good examples of cognitive planning. Thinking about very clearly the objective you need and the learning outcome that will measure the objective. So, as I already said, what happened to me was that it ended up being a really bad lesson. The students weren't focused. In fact, the lesson was so unfocused that I actually thought to myself during the lesson, what am I trying to accomplish here? What do I want students to do? So ultimately, I even realized, I was like, no, something is missing here. I don't have a clear objective. But at that point, it was too late. And the result was that students didn't build any skills. They just copied down the words on that organizer. That didn't accomplish any learning for them. So I'm confident that you have experienced this also. And I want you to think about a time in your teaching experience that you focus on organizational planning rather than cognitive planning to, in your judgment, your detriment. I also want you to think about whether or not this is a thing that you're going to run into as a teacher more than one time. Is this something you should worry about for yourself? Are you going to end up doing a lot of copying and coming up with activities on the fly because you sort of have a hard time thinking about your objectives? Or is this something that's easier for you? And finally, whether or not this is easy for you, it's helpful to think about what allows you to focus on cognitive planning and focus on creating good objectives. So go ahead and pause the video, think about that, and complete a journal entry in your workbook to discuss this, and then we'll come back together. So, presumably you stopped the video, and I want to just reflect here quickly on this susceptibility thing. We're all susceptible to focusing on a worksheet, focusing on an activity, often because we hear something fun from another teacher, and we're like, oh, I want to get a copy of that. And one thing that I experience more and more with other teachers that I work with is the challenges and the problems of Pinterest. Pinterest is, I think, ruining the teaching world. And the reason is that Pinterest focuses us so much on the organizational planning. Cool things to do, cute activities, fun things, but it doesn't focus us usually on the cognitive planning, the creation of really clear objectives. So that's what we want to avoid, is we want to avoid a situation in which we're just doing activities to do them. Even if we use explicit instruction, we don't have a clear objective. That is not going to accomplish anything meaningful. So that's where our checklist comes from. This is the first checklist you're going to see in these modules, and the checklists are critically important. These checklists represent tools to help you think about your instruction. You should be able to check these things off as you teach, as you write an objective, so you can know of yourself, yes, I am creating an objective that actually is going to work for students. So I'll read these to you just so you're familiar with them. If you don't want to hear me read them, you can pause the video or skip forward just a little bit so you don't have to hear me right there. But I'll read them. Choose objectives based on student performance relative to the goals you have for them. The goal will be from IEP or from standards. You're going to choose a goal that's you're going to choose an objective then that's the next step toward the goal. Then you write the objective clearly that has a specific learning outcome, that's singular, and that it goes from where the student presently is just one step forward, and that the learning outcome is described in behavioral terms, specifically what are the behaviors people would have, that assesses the mastery of the objective. So those are the criteria for writing good objectives, and I'm going to describe each of those to you. I'm going to get some help from our imaginary students here. These are Ariana, Noah, and Martin, and their descriptions are written in the workbook, so I'm not going to go over them in detail with you, but you can see that these are students who have different needs, some with IEPs, some who just need intensive intervention, but do not have a specified IEP, and all of them are performing slightly below grade level. You also notice here that all three of them they're all focusing on different areas of instruction because I wanted to give you a range of them. So we're going to talk about these kids in terms of the different aspects of the checklist. First thing is to select a goal from the IEP or from standards. So let's talk about what that means. The goal is something that is a long-term outcome, something that is not going to be finished today or tomorrow. It might be finished at the end of a quarter, the end of 6 weeks, might be something for the end of the year. It's ambitious but reasonable. It's ambitious in the sense that it's not sort of the status quo. We're going to make a little bit of progress. It's ambitious in the sense that we're going to make students move forward at a brisk pace where they will make more progress than we would originally expect of them. We know they can go a little bit further, especially if we make adaptations like increasing explicit instruction. And the goal is the base for the specific lesson's objective. In other words, everything we do should be pushing us toward mastering that objective. Everything we do with objectives should push us toward mastering the goal. The IEP has a critical piece in selecting the goal. If a student has an IEP, it already has goals. And those goals presumably meet these criteria up here. And if that's the case, that's what you should be focusing on, is the IEP. Now, standards also play a role in selecting a goal. Hopefully IEPs have been focused in some way on the standards. But it might not be on grade level standards. And this is important to note that yes, grade level standards are critically important. We want to make sure that students are learning grade level standards. But we might not be doing that immediately. It might be a long-term expectation, depending on students' instructional level. So if students are performing 2, 3, 4 grade levels below, which some of you may have experienced, you may have students like that. I've had those in my experience. In those cases, it's not appropriate to see that they can get to grade level. It is unlikely that that's going to happen. But it is absolutely possible that they can reach an ambitious goal that's foundational to the grade level standard. So even if we aren't meeting the grade level standard, we're doing something that will eventually get us there. A student's goal might not be for them to reach grade level by the end of the year or the end of 2 years even, but it should be closing the gap between student current performance and that grade level expectation. But it should be very clear that we're focusing on instructional level. So let's talk about the selection of a goal based on some of our kids here. So this is Ariana on the left here. And in Ariana's case, she has an IEP. She's focusing on beginning word reading. And her goals read like this. One of them is to read one-syllable word with complex sound spellings, including vowel teams, vowel consonant patterns, using appropriate decoding strategies. So that's one of her goals. And the other is to read level-appropriate text with fluency. So for a given focus, we might focus on just one of those goals. If it's toward the beginning of the year, my thought would be to focus on what? If it was toward the beginning of the year, which of these two would you focus on? Presumably you said to the screen what you were thinking of, or you just thought in your head. Either way is fine. You don't have to talk to the screen. But hopefully you thought about the word reading objective. And I'm going to focus on this one for this student because at this point, if it's early in the year, that's going to be more important than focusing on fluency. Fluency is obviously very important, but reading individual words is foundational to the fluency goal. So that's an appropriate one for her. Let's talk about Martin. Martin's case, Martin does not have an IEP, so we're focusing here on what? On standards. Martin is in grade 5, but he's in grade 3, but he may not be ready for the grade 3 standard. Grade 3 standard with regard to understanding area is to find the area of a rectangle with whole number side lengths by tiling it and showing that the area is the same as would be found by multiplying the side lengths. Okay, so you don't need to know that one. The second one, because I'm just going to tell you that's an ambitious form of the grade 2 goal, which is to partition a rectangle into rows and columns of same size squares and count them to find the total number of them. In Martin's case, this is too difficult for him. He's functioning at grade 2 level, so the grade 2 objective in mathematics is appropriate for him. So we're going to focus on that one here. I will say, though, because we're going to turn to this example, I'm going to explain what partitioning is. So partitioning is when you take something like a rectangle like this, and partitioning is dividing it into equal squares like that. And the idea is that ultimately this is foundational to learning about area because you're breaking something into equal parts, which is then what students in 3rd grade are going to use to figure out how to calculate area. And so in this case, students would know that that's 8 square units, but the idea in 2nd grade is they're just partitioning this and then counting these to know the number of units, and that's, again, foundational. So those are two students that sort of give us some clues. Now let's talk about the 3rd student, Noah. And for Noah, what I'm giving you here is Noah's IEP goals and some standards. And your goal here is to decide what goal should anchor Noah's lesson. I'm going to allow you to read this to yourself because it's in your workbook, and you can do the activity of figuring out what do you think is an objective, the goal that should be the focus of Noah's next period of instruction. So think about that, write it in your activity book, your workbook, and we'll come back together. So pause. Presumably you have written in the activity workbook. So here are the answers that I came up with. Obviously, he has an IEP, so the IEP should be the goal. It's designed to be ambitious and reasonable, meeting our expectations for the goal. And in this case, the grade 5 standard, which is the one for Noah's grade level, is far too advanced. That represents the ultimate goal, but is not going to be the present focus. Now, what I liked about this case study is that in this case study, the grade 3 standard aligns with the IEP goal that Noah has. And so what's really nice is that the standard actually can add clarity to the IEP goal. In this case, the clarity is about building students' fluency around this, and so not some fluency so much as, making it text-dependent questions, returning to text to answer questions about text. And so what's great about the grade 3 standard is it helps us clarify the IEP. That's an excellent example of how we can focus on, let's say, an IEP, but use information from standards to help us. That's all about sort of selecting the goal from the IEP and standards. Now let's talk about choosing a specific objectives that gets us to the next stage in this process. To do that, we're going to begin with students' current skill level relative to the goal. You want to figure that out using assessment data, considering previous instruction, particularly if you just finished the instruction. And then you want to select an objective that moves toward the goal and is not too easy and not too difficult. So obviously, okay, we don't want to be too easy, we don't want to be too difficult. But, you know, particularly the easy part, everyone agrees, well, we don't want to make it easy on the kids. Although perhaps some people feel like, well, these are kids who are struggling, these are kids with disabilities, maybe it's okay to give them a break. And I would argue, and many my colleagues, including you maybe, would argue it's really important not to give students things that are too easy. We already said the goals need to be ambitious, so that's certainly not going to work at the objective level. But what about the difficult part? And I mention this because as I talked about when you I went through the introduction to this module, sometimes people argue we should give students a challenge. Let's give them something that's a little difficult and maybe they can rise to the challenge. But I'm going to argue to you that it's important not to be too difficult. And the question is, why not? What's the problem with being too difficult? I want you to think about that just for a second. It's not in your workbook as an activity necessarily, it's something you can jot down, but I want you to think about why is it important not to push students too far. Think back to the introduction. My answer refers to the cognitive load. As we talked about in the introduction, if you make things too difficult for students, it increases the cognitive load to the point that they can't handle the instruction, and ultimately they won't be successful. So really important not to make it too difficult. So let's now talk about this in terms of Ariana and Martin. So for Ariana, her goal, as we already said, was to read the one-syllable words with the patterns. Currently, based on her assessments, she's mastered short vowel spelling, single-letter consonants, and consonant digraphs. So the next step for her would appropriately be to either continue with consonant digraphs, because she knows some but not all, and we would know which ones those were, or to move now to vowel digraphs. I'm going to say vowel digraphs might be appropriate. There are lots of them, maybe more of them than there are consonant digraphs, and so if they're very common, something like ER or EE, those are different digraphs. ER is, I guess, not a digraph, it's a vowel, R-controlled vowel, but EE is a vowel digraph. That would be an appropriate focus for Ariana. Looking at Martin, Martin's goal is to do this partitioning, which is appropriate for him, but it is a little complex. He can currently name shapes and the characteristics of them, so he knows about rectangles. He knows how to do repeated addition, which is what he's going to need to do if he's going to look at, let's say, the rows, and he says 4 in this column and 4 in this column. And he can divide things into halves. He's shown that he can do that with fractions. He can do that in earlier geometry lessons involving folding and so on. But he has not partitioned rectangles before, and especially when you partitioning across the middle, that's not so hard. But what about the part where you had to divide it into 4 parts so you get these equal squares? That's not easy. So how would we get Martin to that? One thing we could do is to partition squares to start, so it's just a cross through the middle and across this way and across this way. It could be that we use a geoboard to show him how to do, and he can put elastics around different sections of the rectangle. Perhaps we could use tiles to show him how to partition things. We could transition from a simpler version with the tiles to a more complex version where he does it himself. Those could all be different ways of doing this. And none of those is better than the other, but one of those is going to be the focus of our objective. So now, as you can imagine, it's going to be your turn to think about this in terms of Martin. So, sorry, not Martin, Noah. So Noah, his goal is to answer who, what, where, and when questions about text based on his current performance. His current skill is that he's had lots of practice retelling. He may not be perfect with retelling, but it's something he's spent a lot of time practicing. And he can answer who, what, where, and when questions about himself if asked by the teacher in a small group environment, for example. So the question then is, what's the best next step for Martin? Should he, for example, answer all 4 of these types of questions next? And if so, what's your rationale for that? And whether or not you think that's right, what could be something else that we could do next? What would be another next objective to focus on for for Noah. So think about that, and then we'll come back together and I'll tell you what I think the answer is. But take a minute to pause the video, go into your activity workbook, and do that one. So I'll see you in a second. Okay, so you pause the video. Let's go on to telling you what I think the answers are. So I don't think that he should do all 4 types of questions at once. It is the case that he can answer these questions about himself, but that doesn't require text evidence, and text evidence is going to be a new thing. We've already talked about the fact that from the 3rd grade standard, we know that we should focus on text evidence. So that's going to be important to him in doing this process. And that's not something he's had to do with answering questions about himself. He knows the evidence, he knows how he feels. So it's appropriate not to do all of them at once, but to do just one of them, let's say. It is the case he hasn't mastered retelling. So you might say, well, maybe he needs to do more retelling. That should be our objective. And that could be a conclusion that we draw. My suggestion here would be that, well, maybe he hasn't mastered retelling yet, but he can probably increase his retelling skill as a result of answering some of these questions. And so it's appropriate now to move into that even though he hasn't mastered the retelling skill. He'll continue to get practice with that. We'll continue to return to that after he does each of the learning of these questions. So my suggestion would be to start with the who questions because who is very easy to identify in text and to focus on that in the lesson. So that would be the focus of the objective. So now that we figured out sort of what the objective is going to be, not sort of what the objective, but the focus of the objective. Now we actually have to design it. We have to write the focus objective that describes the specific learning outcome we have. We want to focus on a singular next step. And I'm going to say more about that, but I can't emphasize this enough that it's important to just have one singular focus. And then we want to describe that learning outcome in behavioral terms that assesses the mastery of the objective. So the learning outcome, what we're doing there is we're saying, here's what it looks like. In behavioral terms, meaning what are the behaviors people engage in? Not like bad behavior, but here are the things people do to show that they've mastered the learning outcome that assesses the mastery of the objective. And that is a critical thing that sometimes we forget. Often in instruction, we find that people don't do that. Let me say more about both these things. So in terms of the objective being singular, big one here, one, right? So there it is, one. And that means that we're focusing on one skill in each lesson. It's often the case that in lessons that I see, people try to throw 3, 4, 5 skills in there. I have myself written lesson plans in which I had like 4 different objectives specified for one 30-minute period of time. And that is not the way explicit instruction works. If you think back to my strange stones in the bowl, the goal here is to one by one add things into students' sort of cairn of knowledge, place things on students' cairn of knowledge. So we build that systematically. If we focus on multiple skills at the same time, that isn't going to happen. That means that if we are doing it that way, some of our objectives might be met very quickly, and that's fully appropriate. You might have lessons that only last 5 minutes. If you're teaching a vocabulary word, you can think of every word you teach as its own little tiny lesson. And that is fully appropriate. That's what it means to be singular, is that one at a time we're going to teach these vocabulary words, and we're going to do one vocabulary word at a time. Once we learn them all, maybe we have a next objective where we decide to compare and contrast the vocabulary words. But our first thing to do is to do one of these at a time. That's going to be true of any kind of lesson you design, whether it's a skill, whether it's a kind of knowledge. We're not going to try to throw things at students multiply. We're going to do one thing at a time. The idea here with the clarity of the objective, with a clear learning outcome, is that we're going to describe exactly what it looks like for the students to acquire the skill. You should be able to envision when a student has mastered this. What does it look like to master it? What does it look like for a student to sit there at their desk and to actually show you that they're learning the content? And that's a critical idea, is that you should be able to imagine what it looks like as students are doing it. What should be in front of them on the desk? What should they be writing on their whiteboards? How are you going to know that students have actually doing what you want? Sometimes you might even want to, when you're writing your objective, think about it to yourself. Think, how would it look for a student to do what I want them to do? And that's going to be something that I often think about when I write my objectives. So let's look at some examples to see if they met our criteria of being singular and describing the learning outcome. So here's a relatively long example of a lesson. And this is from a curriculum that was designed. This is a curriculum example. That's what the folder means. This is a curriculum example where this is focusing on learning a new sort of idea, something they call here a secret letter team. And the letter team, as they describe, is 2 letters that work together as a team, but they're not next to each other. You can read the rest for yourself. I'm not going to read the whole thing. And so the question here is whether or not the objective is singular or not. And the objective is embedded here in the first paragraph of this. So see if you can figure out whether the objective is singular and whether or not the learning outcome is described. So I'm going to pause here for a second. Go ahead and think about that, and then we'll come back together. It's not in your workbook as an activity that you'll do on your own. Just think about it for a second. So I would say that it is singular. Because the students are learning just to do one graphing. I blank E, that's all they're learning here, is just to do that one thing. Then in terms of it being describing the learning outcome, well, it's not described actually in this because I didn't give you the actual objective, I just gave you the sort of intro to the lesson. But I can tell you from having read the curriculum that students then practice the reading many words that have the I blank E in them. So the actual learning outcome is described in the curriculum. Through virtue of through the activities. In fact, as in many secondary prevention programs, this specific activity is not described as having a specific objective in the curriculum. In general, it says we're going to learn letters and sounds and we're going to read words with them, but not at the beginning of this lesson, which is why I couldn't put it in there. So let's look at another one. And there's an example of when the students did this in the curriculum, when they actually did the activity. So let's look at a second example from a different curriculum. And again, these are all real curricula that we've selected here. So go ahead and read this to yourself and think as you're reading, is the objective singular and does it describe the learning outcome? So think about that for a second after you read, and then I'll tell you what I think. So is it singular? Well, I hope you agree with me that it's absolutely not. So we can count the number of different objectives we sort of have here in this lesson. And again, it's all implied. They don't say what the objectives are. One is that they talk about things being very small. The second is that they teach the students the song. And I put a 3 question mark here because maybe learning the hand motions is even its own objective. In fact, I would say that if I were teaching the students a song and hand motions, I would do those things one at a time. So there are actually 3 objectives in this lesson, not just one, as the lesson sort of implies that this is one thing. So it's a warm-up. But a warm-up should function the same way as everything else and should be done with explicit instruction. You might have little sections of explicit instruction here that you're going to use for this. So this whole warm-up on its own is not a singular, it does not have one singular objective. And I would add here that it's not good explicit instruction because it doesn't say how to teach each of these things. And so thinking back to what I've said about secondary prevention programs is you could say, oh, I can take this and make a specific objective from this just one thing. And you absolutely could. But the curriculum doesn't say to do that. And it certainly doesn't tell you how to do it because it just says teach them the song. It does not tell you what methods to use. So this is exactly why it's important to focus on explicit instruction. So now let's see, does it describe the learning outcome? Well, let's look at our first objective first. So the first objective is not, the learning outcome is not described. So it's not described that students actually remember the words because that would be a learning outcome as they can tell you the words that mean very small. That's not what happened at all. The students just suggested words, which basically makes it not a lesson, in which case I'm not even really sure why the teacher is doing this because it doesn't really give us any new information to the students. So if this lesson were focused on processing this information more, then I would say, okay, we can do a lesson here. But this is just kind of like a throwaway little thing. You almost wonder, why would you bother doing it? With regard to the song and the motions, that is the learning outcome. The entire lesson is just this learning outcome. And so I would say that, yes, you could evaluate whether or not students learned the song and knew the hand motions. So in this case, the learning outcome is sort of implied. Okay, so let's take one more example here. This is another one in which there's a big book and some information about size and so on. So read this example as well, pause the video, decide for yourself what you think about whether or not this is singular and describes the learning outcome, and then I'll tell you what I think. So go ahead and pause, and I'll be right back. Okay, so presumably you pause. So let's talk about whether or not that's singular. I would say again, no. How many objectives are there here? I would say there's one here in terms of big things, another here in terms of little things. The rest of this isn't really an objective at all. It's just sort of informational, right? So it might not be a bad thing to do all of these things, like call attention to the horse and the dog at maybe setting the situation. So that's fine. But the things that the students are being asked to do here is to find things that are big and find things that are little. But it's not really clear what the learning outcome is going to be. We could say that for the can you find and point to other things in the picture that are big? Yes, that maybe is a good example of the learning outcome. But it's not really specified here what the formal assessment is, right? So if we want an assessment of whether or not students know big or know small, we could design one, but it's not clear here how you're going to assess it. Maybe the teacher could listen to students do it or something like that, but there's no clear assessment here. And if we want students to have an objective, then we need to make sure that there actually is a way to measure the objective. So the idea here, focusing on comparing things that are big and comparing things that are small, knowing words for big and small, none of that is a bad thing. I think this is probably a valuable thing for, say, kindergartners to do. But this is not a thing that is clearly described in the curriculum in a way that we could do explicitly. So yet another example of where the objective is not given in the instruction, and you have to kind of figure out what it is. In this case, you would have to decide, do you want to do a whole lesson on big and a whole lesson on small, or do you want to or you just want to not do this at all, for example. So those are decisions you have to make even when you have a secondary prevention program. So we talked about some examples together. You paused the video just a little bit and thought about them briefly. Now it's time to get into this more. So here is an example of a lesson. Yet again, this one is a little bit more comprehension focused. I want you to read this information directly from a curriculum and decide whether or not this has a singular focus and whether or not it describes the learning outcome. Then we'll come back together and I'll tell you what I think. So this one, take the time to pause and process. I say pause and process here instead of stop and jot, because I want you to take a little more time to think about this and to reflect on it in a way that you might write a couple of sentences or something about whether or not you think it's singular. So go ahead and do that and we'll come back together. Good luck. All right, so here's what I think. In terms of it being singular, I would say probably. If students already know beginning, middle, and end, this lesson is great for putting them all together. So I would say in this case, probably does meet our criteria for being singular, but we have to know more about the student's prior knowledge and what was taught previously in the curriculum. Does it describe the learning outcome? Yes, it says very clearly students will use a story map to do this, and so the objective of the lesson is clear and singular and has a description of the learning outcome, so this is fully appropriate to do. Now let's look at this in terms of an example for Ariana and how an objective could be written about her lesson. So we know we're focusing on decoding with her, and for the teaching of the vowel teams, this teacher does not have a program, and so has consulted a scope and sequence of phonics skills, found that EE is a common vowel digraph, and writes the objective to focus on this, and this is the objective the teacher comes up with. Student will read monosyllabic words containing up to 4 sounds in the EE digraph and list of words written on a worksheet. So let's think about the criteria here. The first thing is that the objective has a singular focus. What do we think? Thumbs up, thumbs down. You could give a thumbs up to the computer or a mental thumbs up if you didn't want to sort of be thumbs upping at the computer. And in this case, I would give it a thumbs up myself. 2 thumbs up, like a movie. Because it has the EE digraph, all the words have the EE digraph in them. That's the focus that we want to focus, that's what we want to focus on here. Is the learning outcome described in behavioral terms? Could we measure the way it looks? I give it a big thumbs up here also. Big sort of curly thumbs up, very, very good thumbs up. I would say also it's very clearly specified how students are going to do that. So is it singular? Yes. And is it describe the learning outcome? Yes, it does. Students are going to read those words. What if the objective were something different? What if the objective were a student will understand monosyllabic words containing up to 4 sounds in the EE digraph by spelling words with this pattern? So would this be an example of an objective that would align with where we would have it's singularly focused and the learning outcome is described in behavioral terms to assess mastery of the objective. So think about that for a second. What about this one? I've already actually kind of given you the answer earlier in the module by saying, no, if you're focusing on spelling, spelling is not the focus. If we want students to learn about spelling, we would want to do a spelling lesson. And that spelling lesson might not take a long time, and that's fine. But if we are going to have students focus on reading words with the EE digraph, then they need to be focusing on reading the words. So that one does not meet the criteria because the learning outcome doesn't match the objective. If we want to focus on reading, which is what the objective was designed to do, then we're not doing that by us doing spelling, okay? So really important that we have that clear focus. Let's flip over to Martin's example now. So for this area lesson, we know it's helpful for students to use tiles to represent a rectangle in the way students will do later. That was one of the options that I had come up with before. So the objective could be written this way. Students will cover a rectangle with tiles, count them, and write the number of tiles when given a worksheet containing examples. So does this meet our criteria of being singular, and does it meet our criterion of describing the learning outcome in behavioral terms? Well, is it singular? Yes, we're going to do something specifically, which is to determine to name the area essentially by covering a rectangle with tiles, counting them, and writing the number of tiles. We're not calling it area yet, but we are actually preparing students to do that by covering it one by one. So that is a good objective for Martin for this lesson. Now let's look at an example from a teacher. So in this example, we have Ms. Whaley. And Ms. Whaley is a teacher that I've worked with. She actually is a doctoral student here at UConn. And she is going to give us some example about the way she would teach a lesson on the roles of the branches of government. What's interesting about this lesson is you're going to see her do 4 different things. She's going to do 4 different objectives. And the 4 objectives are going to allow you to think about whether or not these objectives meet our criteria based on the checklist that we've given you already. So you want to have that checklist out. Look for it in your workbook so you can look at the checklist. When you have the checklist, then you can then look at the video and you can decide whether or not, and as you go, think about whether or not Ms. Whaley's objective, each one of them, meets our criteria. So I'll step out the screen so you can watch Ms. Whaley's video, then we'll come back together and I'll tell you what I think.
I'm really excited to start planning my unit about the roles of the branches of state government. I need to come up with an objective to help me plan my lesson. I think it would be a really good activity to have the students act out the different roles of state government. I could give them materials, they can make costumes, we can do some dramatic play, some theater. I think they'd really enjoy that. They could design the outfits and act the roles out with each other. So my objective would be students will learn about the roles of the 3 branches of state government. If I want to make sure that the students really know about the roles of state government, I think it'd be good for me to write the definitions on the board and have them copy them down. They could use the words in a sentence, and then I'd know for sure that they understood what they were learning. So my objective would be, students will be able to state the roles of the branches of the state government by recording the definitions and using each word in a sentence. I really want to make sure that my students understand the roles of the branches of state government, and also that different states have slightly different state government structures. So my objective would be, students will learn the roles of the branches of government and how they differ by state. If my students are going to really learn this content and know the roles of the branches of state government, I want them to know the definitions, but I also want them to really know what those roles mean. So I need to design a lesson where they show their understanding of the roles, and I need to think through what kind of an assessment I'm going to use so that they can show that they've learned these things. I think that I'll just have them identify or match the roles and with a description on a list. So my objective would be, students will be able to identify the different roles of the 3 branches of state government by selecting correct examples of their functions from a list. When I plan the activities to go with this objective, though, I need to make sure that they're still engaging. They can be fun, but I need to make sure that the students are still cognitively processing the content that we've learned.
Okay. You can see there at the end, Ms. Laser being like, is that what I was supposed to do? And the answer is yes. She did a great job, didn't she? So round of applause for Ms. Laser. Don't do it, because people are going to think it's weird. So I think that's a great example, though, of the 4 different types of objectives. So let's talk about those objectives. And if you haven't already, you're going to pause and process and look at the checklist and see whether or not each of the objectives that she came up with met the criteria for being a good objective based on those checklist criteria. So do that now, if you haven't already, as you're watching the video, sort of rate these, whether or not these are good objectives. I'm going to tell you then briefly what I think. So go ahead and do that, and then we'll talk about it. Okay. Her first objective, she talked about having some fun with this, right? Fun is not a warning word, but I always wonder with the fun things, if it's fun, are we focusing on just the fun and the play here, or are we focusing on meeting the objective? She said she wants students to know the roles of state government, but the activities that she chose may not actually do that. And she was not specific in showing how it would be measured. So she has this idea in her mind that they're going to have fun with this, but she doesn't specify that in the objective. And so it does not describe a learning outcome, even though she thought of one, although the one she thought of may or may not be appropriate for the students. The second one that she did described that she was going to have students do this with writing definitions down from the board. So she did limit the objective to one singular next step, but it's not getting her toward her larger goal. If she wants students to understand state government, it's not going to help her for them just to write down some definitions, because that's not going to accomplish that broader goal. And so does she describe in behavioral terms though? Yes, she absolutely does. Her third objective was about comparing the state government to other state governments. And for a single lesson, that would not be singular. It's even questionable whether or not describing the different roles of the three of them would be singular, but we can say we'll give her the benefit of the doubt that that would be at least singular. But certainly comparing different states, different governments is not at all singular because that's going well beyond the first goal of just comparing the different roles. Then does that describe though the learning outcome? Yes, it does. She did not describe how students would show her that they actually would describe these differences. So I don't have a picture of what the learning outcome would look like. And that's a good example of a case where, just like I did a moment ago, it's easy to get yourself flummoxed. Say, oh no, but she did not describe it. And actually, as I'm thinking about that objective, I'm not sure how I would get students to show me that they understood the difference between the state governments. There are a lot of states. There are 50 states, I believe. No, I know. There are 50 states, sorry. No, definitely 50 states. And that's a lot of different states. And so I am realizing, as I even say this out loud, I'm not sure how I would design a learning outcome that describes in behavioral terms what it looks like to master the objective. How would I know? Now, I've got to figure that out as part of writing the objective because that's going to determine how all of my lesson fits together. Her final objective was the one that I thought was most appropriate. She had a sense of how she was going to do this. She had 3 different roles of government, and she thought that she would have students circle the ones from a list. So she now has a clear picture of, after she describes them and has students practice them together, they'll end by circling them on a list when she gives them some independent practice, which is part of the explicit instruction framework, as we've talked about. So and it's a nice opportunity there to help you sort of think about the different ways in which all of these things get put together. And so now you're going to have a chance to make other people do the work. You're going to get to be your own Ms. Whaley here. And what you're going to do then is you're going to come up with a short case study, sort of like the one with Ms. Whaley, where she described her class that she's teaching this lesson. You want to describe an actual student. You could be a real student you have. It could be an imaginary student. What you want to do is describe the goal, the larger goal for the student, the source for the goal that you have is from an IEP, from standards, and then the next step in the learning process. So you don't have to write what the objective is, but you need to give people the topic, what would be the next step toward learning the goal. And you're going to post that without in the post describing what the objective is, because when you go online, you're going to read other people's goals the next step after you post your own, and you're going to write a possible objective for somebody else's goal. And then you're going to look at what other people have written because other people are going to do the same thing for you. And when you look back at your own case study, you're going to see how well the objectives other people came up with for yours match the checklist. And this way you can have a dialogue with other people. They can say whether or not the objectives you came up with work for their case studies, and you can tell other people if the objectives they wrote for your case study works for your case. So an interesting opportunity to kind of go back and forth about this. So don't write the answer for the objectives for your case. You're going to do it for other people's and have a conversation about that. We have some guidelines for posting on the discussion board written here to remind you how valuable and important it is to share some different ideas, get clarification, extend the conversation. You want to make sure you respond directly to others and provide specific feedback using the checklist. Keep it short, but keep it clear and content focused. And do things in a nice way. I like the term generosity of spirit to indicate that. So make sure that you fill in the discussion board, have a great conversation with some folks, and then when you're done with that, you can come back together. You're obviously not going to do all that at once. Come up with that case study now and post it, and then as you go forward, you can go back and do that. This is going to be something you'll finish before the end of the module. So to wrap up then, the key points from this objective were to choose objectives based on the student performance relative to the goals, then write objectives that describe the specific learning outcome. And I think we've done that well. And here's the checklist that we gave you in order to show that you've mastered that objective. I want to close here by talking about the importance of these checklists. So we have these checklists in here not because we like to check out boxes, although it can be fun to check out boxes. No, the reason we have these checklists is because it's going to allow you to judge yourself and judge other people's lessons, not in a good or bad kind of way, where we'd say, oh, I really like that lesson. No, you don't even want to say about yourself. I mean, you want to like your lessons, but not because you have this vague sense of a lesson being good or not. It's because you're going to look at your lessons and look at your objective, look at all of your instruction relative to the criterion, relative to what we describe on the checklist as good practice. And so if you look at the checklist and you say, yeah, I did that, and I did that, then you did it, and you met the criteria. So the focus is on following the checklist, not on being vaguely good or bad, or I liked it, or maybe you could have changed some things. No, did it follow the checklist or not? So these checklists are really powerful tools for taking things out of the space of evaluating others and into a space of comparing what we do to criteria. So that's why I hope you enjoy the checklists. We're going to close this module with a quiz. Here are the first few questions of the quiz. The quiz has 7 questions in total. This is a good opportunity to sort of solidify your understanding of all this module's content. So I want you to go ahead and take the quiz, and good luck on the quiz. When you're finished, we'll have a video for you where you can get the quiz answers, and you can decide, and I'll tell you what I think the answers are, and you can decide whether or not you agree or disagree. So go ahead and take this quiz. Good luck on the quiz. And when you're finished, you can watch the video to see if you agree with my answers. Or maybe if you're taking a class with an instructor who decides you can't do that, well, that's fine too. They can tell you what they think and maybe what I thought, especially if they disagree. So good luck on the quiz. And I'll be back to tell you the answers if you're allowed to do that.